Dear Jeb, I hope you are doing well. It seems like there is a big focus lately on the exploring side of Minecraft. 1.7 adding new biomes, 1.8 adding new structures, 1.9 adding new end content, 1.10 giving reasons to go out and find new loot, 1.11 adding mentions and cartographers. I wanted to add my thoughts on these updates with this video. New structures are generally always great, but there is one problem with every structure: longevity. Finding a new structure eventually becomes a more and more stale experience. You've explored one, you've explored them all. This is an issue with pretty much everything, but at least there are things we can do to slow down this process of getting bored with new content, specifically regarding structures. The obvious solution to this for some would seem to be adding tons of new structures, but keeping the rarity of finding a structure relatively the same. So instead of finding a desert pyramid every time you find a desert, you might find a desert dungeon or a desert tomb or something like that. This approach does have its issues. First of all, you still have that issue of once you've explored one, you've explored them all. Sure, you're delaying that process for some players, but not by much unless you're adding massive structures like the Mansion, which also isn't efficient because they take quite some time to implement. The other solution is to add more randomization to a structure. The Mansion already does this by having tons of possible rooms, however, it lacks variance in the structure itself. The strongholds, fortresses, and mineshafts have a lot of variance in structure, but lack room diversity. I feel like the perfect structure would be a lot of variance both structurally and in room variation, but again, this also has its issues. These structures are harder to tame, come with more bugs, take more time to implement, and are just harder to make in general. I know this because I have experimented with both methods of generation. I used to have structures which were randomly generated but didn't have very interesting rooms. I had a structure which was randomly generated, had a few interesting rooms, but lacked interest in the design itself. Hey guys, I wanted to share with you this mostly randomly generated room. Let's press this button, and as you can see, we have a slightly different room. So as you can see, there are multiple entrances to get inside. There are 3 main floors, and you can get between floors without having to exit the temple sometimes. Alright, so we've got a staircase generated here. It's all planned, only I'm not using the clone command. This is all done just with command blocks. All of this, yes. So then there's this middle ground which I am proposing. Come up with a few designs for how rooms can be laid out. Pick a main path, and then add wall sections which have a 75% chance to spawn a wall to slightly change the layout of the individual rooms without interfering with the main path. If you ever feel like adding more variance to a structure, then you can add a new room layout or add new room types. I think that's one of the cool things about using structure blocks in Mansions. You can always build more rooms. Unfortunately, simply building more rooms doesn't hold much weight on its own, but combined with variance in structural planning, we might have a different story. This approach also has another advantage, and that is the control over level design. Procedurally generated structures aren't very good at designing, but people are. By having control over how you want each room to lay out, you can meticulously design what kind of experience you want the player to have. Let me explain a bit more. Let's say you want to create an underground desert tomb. You would first design a room layout you think would work. Perhaps it works as a slow descent as the player gets closer and closer to the center, starting off with small rooms and gradually including large rooms towards the end. You'd decide where you want the rooms, but leave them as empty spaces for them to randomly generate in later. You could also include branching paths, which have a 25% chance of appearing. Or, if you decide to include loops in the dungeon, make it so the loop has a 75% chance of being closed. This way, your room layout isn't the same every single time. A bit like how the igloo has a 50% chance of spawning in that underground dungeon, or how the ocean monument maze is always slightly different. Once you've decided the ins and outs of your dungeon, you can design a few rooms which would fit in nicely with your design. a few 11 by 11 rooms, a few 7 by 7s, or maybe some 3 by 3 structures that always appear in the hallways. Next up, before you release the structure, you create another room layout. Instead of this one being a slow descent, this one gets more and more cramped as you get closer to the center. You don't have to make many rooms because that step is already completed. It's just the layout you need to create. By creating a few room layouts, you're creating more varied experience for the players, even though all you're doing is changing the layout, branching paths, loot, rooms, and loops. Actually, that's a lot of variables, and you have quite a bit of control over them too. It seems like a long process for just one type of structure, but since this method is less bug prone, more design focused, creates more longevity, creates variety in one structure, I believe it is the better approach to dungeon design. Furthermore, it's not an overwhelming amount of new content. I believe adding one structure that is always unique every time you find one is much better than adding 4 structures which feel the same every time you explore them. That one structure you added has more longevity and is less overwhelming than adding 4 structures which are identical to each other. Remember, it's depth we want to add, not complexity. How do I know this works? Well, I've already created a concept for this with command blocks. Here's my tutorial. So what have I actually done here? Well, I've got a dungeon here. So I'm going to just load this, and as you can see, we get a slightly different dungeon with different rooms here. Plays out quite differently. Now, if I want a completely different floor plan, I can just add a 2 onto here, and then you can see that this dungeon has a very different feel. As you can see, this one can actually go upstairs, which is another feature which is very easy to implement with this method here. If you're still not convinced by these concepts and you want to see a full-scale practical example of this in-game, then you can try out my structures module, which features a snow dungeon which applies all these concepts. Granted, I am using commands, but I believe the concepts and theories I have applied can be transferred into the game code. But I'm not finished. All I've talked about this episode are the big structures. What about the small structures, like igloos or desert wells? Well, I do believe we could use a few more of those, but only for aesthetic purposes. They don't provide a whole lot of longevity, but it is nice for explorers to discover them. They add more life and discovery to the world and reduce the monotony of searching for big structures and new biomes, but only if they're not overly repetitive and common. This seems like such a minor addition, but the implications are huge for explorers. Structures like mansions are placed far away because the intent is to give the player a journey. That journey would be far more interesting if there were just some simple things to discover along the way. Say I'm going to the mansion, and on my way there I find an abandoned shack, a shrine, and a spider's nest. Those are parts of the journey I'll remember, not the countless amounts of trees I happen to pass. In conclusion, the structures system could use a lot of work and has plenty of room for new additions, but we need to be smart about how each structure is implemented. How long will it take to implement? How long will it take before players get bored? How much complexity does the structure add? Instead of blindly suggesting tons of new structures to add, I think we need to start discussing how we add them for longevity and fun. As always, thanks for watching.